are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon to all our listeners, particularly in Greenwich Mean Time from a European perspective. Of course, good morning to all our listeners in the United States and that side of the Atlantic. And then, of course, for everyone in the Southern Hemisphere, we tend to have quite a large following working with Metrifit in Australia and New Zealand. It's that bit later in the night, so good evening and good early morning to all of you. Cian O'Neill is my name here, based in Cork Institute of Technology, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all here today to engage, which is important as well as just to listen, but to engage with Dr. John P. Sullivan, one of the foremost authorities in the world in the area of sports science. He's also a clinical sports psychologist, but with a particular interest in the role of the brain, and the brain in functionality, the brain in performance, the brain in health. So John, you're very, very welcome to be with us here today, and myself as well as all the listeners are very excited to hear what you have in terms of educating us on the message you've been preaching for quite a few years at this stage.
I appreciate that welcome, and excited to be here to engage and converse about the performing brain and its importance to all of us. And like you, I'm really thankful for everyone taking the time around the world.
That's great. That's great. And just to say to all our listeners, this webinar is sponsored by Metrifit, and I'd just like to say a special hello and thank you to CEO of Metrifit, Peter Larkin, and CTO, Anne Brune, who are listening in keenly. They've been very supportive of educational webinars in high performance, like we've had in the past with Tim Gabbett, and particularly today with yourself, John. So great to have that support to get your message out there globally. Now, John, I'm just looking through your profile here. Fascinating read. Your background, your history, it's broad, it's wide, it's varied. Let's just start from someone like myself, who's also a practitioner from a coaching perspective, but also happens to work in third level university education, so linking kind of theory education with practice. How do you find that dual role in terms of mixing them both, or perhaps one feeding into the other?
Well, I think you've put it very nicely there. I think they do feed into each other quite well. As a practitioner, it informs my scholarly work and the research that I do, whether it be applied or in cases laboratory-based, and then my research really informs my practice. And that really comes from the heart of my training as a clinical psychologist and sports psychologist. It informs it because we really need to be scientist practitioners. Otherwise, it's very easy to get far afield because we're dealing with human beings. The biggest thing we have to really protect is talent, and we certainly don't want to do harm. And certainly we've seen evidence of that by a recent story that was in the news in the United States. Applying sports science, whether it be strength and conditioning or elsewhere, can harm athletes. And so that's why I really find it grounding and informative and sharp to be a scientist practitioner.
Yeah, absolutely. That story arising out of University of Oregon, I'm sure you're talking about, has been reaching this side of the Atlantic as well. Were you surprised by that, John, or is that the type of thing that perhaps goes on all too often, but it takes something like such a serious incident like this to bring it to the certainly national airwaves in the States, but international levels too?
Yeah, Kina, I wish I could say I was surprised. I'm not. I think when you look at overtraining rates, not just in North America but around the world, we do at times, again, go away from the science about understanding that everything is timing and dosing. And we can overdose, and we can overdose on very good things. And that old models of looking at that, pushing people to their limits, it's not actually training, it's trauma. And it can be a small T or a big T, that's a long hallway, but it's not opportunity for adaptation or evolution. So unfortunately, I'm not surprised. And actually, there was an incident in 2011 in Iowa that was very, very similar. So I think there needs to be a shift in a model, specifically in North America, about how we apply science in sport. But you're right, it should get the type of press it's receiving, because it allows us to inform ourselves, and every university should have the next day sitting down going, how could we prevent this from happening here? And then what policies and procedures can we put in place? My question is, how many universities did that? Or is it it won't happen here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, in Gaelic games in our own country here in Ireland, which is an amateur sport, but what I like to say with a professional ethos, in terms of, you know, the training, the sacrifice that our athletes go through, even though they still need to get up for work every Monday morning, having played in front of anywhere from 20 to 50,000 the day before. What I've often seen, you know, as a coach and a manager myself, is whereby one team is successful, you know, based on a certain philosophy or a certain training methodology or regime, that all of a sudden everybody sees that as best practice and they start to copy that. But copying it isn't enough for them. They want to take it to another level because they want to get an extra 10% from what the team they're mimicking, if you like, did, not understanding that everything should be really tailored and specific to the group of athletes or players you're working with. So there certainly is no such thing as one size fits all when it comes to coaching. Is that fair to say?
I think that's very fair to say. What you're touching upon really strong roots of science, strong foundations. Darwin's research in 1859 cannot be understated about how good of research that was, examining human variation. If we want profound knowledge in training anybody, whether we talk about sport, we talk about academics, we talk about medicine, industry, business, we have to be looking at human variation. The one-size-fits-all is making false assumptions. The challenge, and I'm empathetic to this challenge, having the honor of working with coaches, is they don't coach a team. They coach a group of individuals. Yes. And how do I evaluate that information so I can time and dose a stimulus that causes growth and adaptation over time? Because we've kind of developed an ethos here in North America. I think it's relatively similar around the world, but having the opportunity to work around the world, is that this performance is separate from health, and that's just not true. And in fact, the basis of all performance is brain health. If we don't have brain health, we don't have health. So thus, we cannot perform.
Sure, and that's great, because that's angling us in towards the key focus of today's talk. And just to remind all our listeners, if you have questions, keep them feeding in here, guys, because it's rare you'll get the opportunity to have this kind of one-on-one audience with John as such, because I'll certainly endeavour to do my very best to put all the questions that come in real time to John while we work our way through the themes we plan to work on today. But just before we move on to your book, The Brain Always Wins, and the key messages there, as a coach once again, and as a supporter, as someone who likes being the audience watching sport, I'm fascinated by your mixed and your varied experience in sport. Obviously, you have a long-standing relationship with the NFL, but you've also conducted work with with the NBA, MLS, Major League Soccer, the English Premier League, which is just across the water from us, and even down in Australia. Is that a passion of yours? Has it just arisen through work, John, or how did that come about to be so immersed in pro sport across many different codes and disciplines?
Yeah, Keaton, that's a great question. I think it has come from, I think passion drives our direction or our final destinations. But I think the bigger piece of it is that performance is performance. You can move across, there are subtleties to every sport, no doubt, and I have to get up to speed with those when I'm working with coaches and athletes in particular sports. But when we look at the brain, there isn't anywhere it doesn't have a stake in the entirety of a performance. Again, even if we go outside of sport. So when you look at the principles of the performing brain, there are things that always are a part of a performance. And that's exciting to me. And it's exciting to also see people be training in very, very particular regimes, as you were talking about, and then when you add in a deeper understanding of brain physiology central to everything else, how much more open to resiliency, health, and then performance can be. But they've been unique opportunities, and certainly have been humbled. I've worked with 42 different sports now in my career, and they've been humbling opportunities for sure. Enjoyable. Enjoy the variety.
Fascinating, fascinating. And I won't ask the cliche question of, what do you find is the differences between American footballers or basketballers or hockey players, but what I'm also particularly interested in, and I would value your thoughts on this, is the work you conduct with the military and law enforcement. Do you see significant correlations between the mindsets of your pro athletes and law enforcement and military? Are they distinctly different, or are there kind of commonalities between the two cohorts?
Well, this is where I would say the commonalities are, in the sense that most sports were designed as military training exercises to either teach tactics, formations, communication, or how to, leadership exercises. So when you look at the history of most sports, that's where they come from. So there's always this ethos from the military. Where they diverge is really interesting. So I would say at this point in time, and I've said this before in public forums, that the elite military is probably the leader in sports science and sports medicine, especially around the areas of concussion. Because it's quite fascinating. When you get to the points of life and death, we become a lot more specific in our details, as opposed to where sport will eyeball a lot of things. And that may differ from culture to culture. I know that certainly Europe and Australia has used much more technology to use objective measures than North America, who is, early in this process. At the same time, there is a similar ethos because of where sport comes from, military affiliated, but not everything from the military crosses over. It just doesn't. Oregon is an example. That was military type training that isn't often necessarily fitting to the military, but certainly not fitting to American football. So the ethos is there. It can be good, it can be bad, but they are the leaders in sports science because of life and death.
Wow, and that's interesting. I'm sure not many people would ever consider it that way, but to hear it from your good self, it really reinforces that point. That's fascinating. Thanks, John. I think that's a great introduction to the audience and to everybody listening. It's certainly time to move on, and let's focus about the key reason we're here today, which is to talk about your book, The Brain Always Wins, and indeed some of the key thematic areas that you'd like to discuss with us. The performing brain is a very apt kind of first area to look at, considering we've talked a lot about the brain and its importance. Would you like to give us just a brief introduction on your thoughts on that and the role it plays in the book itself?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things that we talk about in the book, but I think it's really clear, it needs to be clarified, that often we use the term brain and mind interchangeably, and scientifically they're not. When we talk about the mind, and this may be the first some of our listeners, because I don't think we've been quite honest about this in science, or we've been not honest in how we describe it. We don't know what the mind is. We still don't know why we have human consciousness. We don't know the origin of it. We have tremendous scientific teams, both in Europe and the United States and elsewhere, working on those questions. These are questions that came from Plato, so from ancient Greece. And we still don't know. What we do know at this point in time is the brain is the origin of our mindset, our mental capabilities, why we have consciousness, and it more than likely serves a survival purpose. It gave us another way to kind of check in, to stay safe, and that came with the evolution of the growth of the brain. And the last part of the brain that grows is the prefrontal cortex, the part just beyond our forehead. And so when I talk about the brain, I'm talking about the organ. And we actually know much more about that than we do mental capacities, which are traditionally thought of in sports psychology. And quite frankly, I think we've wasted too much time in an area that we still don't know what it is. The brain, we have much more levers there to control, because the brain and brain health controls how we think, how we perceive, how we self-talk. So when we wrote this book, it was really about filling a gap in the research, or not so much in the research, but more so in the narrative. I was quite surprised that there was this huge gap, and I kept seeing it when I sit with my patients, when I sit them with, when they have concussions, that the parents, I'm sitting with them as well, and they're like, we don't learn anything about the brain. All this stuff is fascinating, but also useful on an everyday basis for health and performance. And so when we talk about the performing brain, we're really talking about the organ itself.
And that's very interesting from my perspective as someone who's worked for many years with different sports psychologists and at different levels of ability, I would have to say. Some better than others, naturally enough, which is always the case. But very often when you think of sports psychology as a method of sports science support and performance enhancement, people often think of the mind and the role that the sports psychologist has with their mind, as opposed to what you're alluding to here, which is really about their brain.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I would say, to be very clear, because you always have to be honest with the science, there's a bidirectional, we do know there's a bidirectional interaction between our consciousness and the brain, and it does have an effect on our health. What we're discovering is it is not as big a lever for every one of us to be healthier and better performers than we once perceived. That actually our evolution and adaptation is based upon our brain's health, and we have greater control over that, which leads to other opportunities.
Okay, I'm just looking at that slide. Thanks for that, John. It's very interesting. Everything is controlled by the brain. And I can't help but think back 4 days ago to the dying seconds of the Packers game last Sunday night, GMT. And Mason Crosby stepped up to kick that field goal, and just as the ball was about to be snapped, the timeout was called. He still followed through and kicked it, but then he had to go and repeat that process because the officials had granted the timeout. What was going on there? I look at fast, accurate decision making in your slide. I look at managing emotions. I look at focus and concentration. What must have been going through his mind, knowing that he's already done it, but is there a seed of doubt there that he's done it already? Can he reproduce it? Can you give us an insight into what was going through his mind there?
Yeah, I can talk about the real general steps of what we know, what happens in those brain processing moments. So we have to start first with the emotions run the show in sport and life. They really do. They have a direct connection to our cognitive, how we think. They have a direct connection to our memory, direct connection to our sensory systems, how we manage our survival circuitry, and then our motivation. So we feel first, then think. And most of us get taught in a Western world that we think first, then feel. And that's not how it works. That's not how we're wired. Evolutionary-wise, our emotions have allowed us to adapt and survive. So more than likely, every high performer in those situations has to regulate their emotions to be comfortable. One bridge to the brain to being able to do that is respiration rate. We know that in panicked response or anxiety, any of us will notice a heart palpitation go up, blood pressure go up. These are innate physiological, neurophysiological responses. Why? Because as blood pressure goes up, we're bringing glucose and vitamins and minerals to the brain because it thinks threat. So when we regulate our breath rate, we are now regulating our emotions, which now allows us to think more clearly and then get to higher levels of the brain where human movement, focus, concentration. So from an athletic standpoint, if one cannot manage emotions, then the other sequences get thrown off. And another thing that happens that most athletes will talk about is, I'm starting to think too much. Well, that's quite unique. That's quite unique, and all of us can relate to this who are listening. How many people have driven their car, gotten somewhere, and they have no idea how they got there? Because, yes, we've all done it. Oh yeah, I've at least done it 2 or 3 times this week. Because once you're a master of something, you've mastered the emotional regulation processes, the cognitive input of, I see the pattern and I know how to execute it, and that unlocks the higher level stuff related to human motion. And when we get anxious, we think, as again, going back to adaptive survival mechanisms, because we have a big brain, we think. But when you're a master at something, you cannot think yourself back to engaging in the process in a state of an ideal performance state, or what some people will call flow. We have to get calm and then see and do. So when interventions happen in sports psychology, where sports psychologists are telling people to think about thinking, you're already neurologically on the wrong path.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. You mentioned something as basic there as respiration or your breathing rate. For anybody out there who, whether they play, I mean, just socially, recreationally, or at a competitive level, whether it's a foul shot in basketball or a penalty in rugby or American football, or whatever the case may be, you know, a golfer ready to take a swing, even without having the services of a sports psychologist, at its most base level, controlling respiration rate and trying to achieve that state of calm, you would see as a, you know, as a key component of a successful outcome, would you?
Absolutely. There's even research and recent research and research that's maybe about 5 years old as well that shows even in an academic setting, if you can provide an understanding to students in high pressure situations or in learning environments where anxiety can go up. You know, there's this thing in our culture in North America, don't know about it in Ireland or the UK or elsewhere, about math phobia. So they've shown that if students are more calm in those moments, respiration control, it's the bridge to the brain, and we'll talk about why it is at other moments, that they're able to attend more, take in the information with greater ease, declare it, and show procedural knowledge of it. So it's not just in a sport performance. We can see it because performance is performance. We can see it in other environments as well.
Okay, very good, very good. We just have a question coming in from Noah here. John, he's thinking back to your point about think about thinking, and he's just asking, could you elaborate on that point?
Sure. So often I will see this in many points in performance, whether we talk about sport or elsewhere. And so an athlete may be struggling. We'll go back to the example you used because I think a closed skill like kicking, meaning, okay, you get to start and stop it. It kind of starts with you. You get to set yourself. In those situations when anxiety comes up, people might say, okay, now think about the times when you kicked well. All right. So if you have someone that's done something like field goal kicking, or
Sure.
extra point kicking in, you know, AFL football in Australia. They have done that thousands of times. They have a process, and most of that process, if you break it down from a neuroscience standpoint, has to do with regulation of the brain so they can just see and do. There's not a lot of thinking involved. So if you intervene with someone and tell someone, what I want you to do in your routine now is to start thinking about kicks that you've made that is good. What we see from the neuroscience and neuropsychology of that, you're now interfering with a process that has been well developed, and now you're extending learning time back to mastery. You're asking someone to think. When athletes at this high level don't think, they see and do. We take in information from our visual systems. We feel about it. Feelings give us a sense of how we may be able or need to adjust, and then we execute upon that decision. And so that's where an intervention is not going to be helpful, thinking about thinking.
Okay, that's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And just thanks to Noah for that question. Noah's dialing in as the head swimming and diving coach in Tiffin University, Miami. So it's great to hear from you, Noah, and thanks for your question. Just to move away from performance, actually, and the role with the brain and health and high performance. You used the term process as an acronym. Extending that to physical activity, rest and recovery, and so on and so forth. Would you like to elaborate on that a small bit? And if anyone else has any more high performance questions, we can always go back to those too for our listeners.
Sure. Really, the process wheel really is developed from a science-first approach. So as Chris Parker and I from the University of Nottingham-Trent were writing the book, we were looking at the collective of research in each one of these areas on the process wheel. And what we discovered was when we were looking at regression analyses, okay, which has the most power to import abilities or protect health? And as we started looking at it, it jumped out at us, this acronym. So when we look at physical activity, it is clearly exercise is medicine. We know this. There is reams of research about this. Again, that has to be timed and dosed appropriately, but it is. In sport, it's slightly different in the sense that sport is not necessarily neuroprotective because of a lot of the other dynamics, but when we think about exercise in general, for people who just exercise and are not in competitive sport, incredibly powerful. When we look at rest and recovery, because we have evolved to build off of adaptation, and then adaptation leads to resiliency, and that leads to evolution, we are kind of wired to need rest. Nutrition the same way. We are touching really just early times now in the science of the gut-brain axis and the microbiome, but it's clear that a calorie is not a calorie, and that food is also individual variation. And so much of what we know about sport nutrition and nutrition in general will be rewritten, and it already is. A clear example is this, is we've always kind of observed this. People have food allergies. You could have peanut butter and have an allergy response. I could eat it and be fine, and then there's someone in the middle that may get some slight nausea with that. So there's variation in how we eat that provides neurotransmitter release. We didn't eat for presentation. We didn't eat because of flavor profile generally, and we didn't eat, in ways that we do now that's changed our gut biome. Then we look at cognitive training. We all have a variability in cognitive abilities, whether we talk about functional memory or decision making, but we have ways to manage it and enhance it. So we get into that in the literature on that and the controversy of some of that literature too. And I've already talked about emotional management. An example of human variation with that is we all have triggers. We literally, all of us have words that bother us, that will affect our emotions. And then socialization, we're wired to be social beings. If you isolate someone, and they've done these studies because we send people to Space Lab. If we isolate people too much, they get depressed and get anxious. We are wired to connect. So these are critical for our health. And then the synergy part is that, again, that human variation, it's not cookie cutter. And so we developed this process really by looking at the research and allowing the research to guide us about what are the most powerful protective parts of brain health that lead to optimization of life and then lead to more consistent performance.
Okay, wow, very good and very thorough as well. And that's that process wheel is just something that kind of was developed over a period of time with yourself and your collaborators, John?
Yes, absolutely, and certainly, research of my own that I've done on functional systems work, that we're all a functional system, and we need to evaluate these key areas. And I'll go back to an example that from the question we had earlier. So often, when people will go, okay, I'm really having some negative thoughts when I perform. I'm very much, when I'm in that performance situation, I'm thinking too much. And before I would just see and do. When we look at that example, which is quite common, often what is done in sports medicine and sports science is we skip over the functional foundations. So if we don't sleep 7 hours, which is the healthy range of 7 to 10, we get anxious. We think more. That's functional. It's our brain and our CNS giving us signals that we're not 100%. It knows we're not 100%. So it's creating vigilance. So if we intervene with, okay, now I'm just going to start working with the cognitions, the thoughts, the negative thinking, but we skip over, this person isn't sleeping, they're not hydrated regularly, and they're skipping meals. All these things will fire warning signs through the CNS that can show up in other ways than just thought processes, but thought processes is that avenue as well. So if we don't look at a functional system process, then we inherit the problems of not looking at a process.
Yeah, that's very interesting because it actually ties in with the Metrifit platform itself in terms of some of the psychometric measures in terms of every day. Any athletes that work with this platform, they're filling in their morning questionnaire stroke app in terms of sleep duration, sleep quality, mood state, stress levels, all trying to arrive at a readiness to train or a readiness to perform percentage. So would you see value in having apps or technological platforms like that taking on board what you've just said in terms of educating the athlete and informing the coach about the current state or readiness to perform of their athletes.
Absolutely. You know, and you used a term that is often used, readiness, and it's far more apt because its definition really draws from neuroanatomy. Assessing when someone's ready really talks about the CNS, and the CNS is the central. And think about that. We spend more time on the periphery meaning away from the brain, but the brain is central. And anytime we can gather information that's subjective and objective, it allows us to look more carefully. And I know there is big discussion now about looking at RPE, which is valuable, and acute-chronic ratios. However, if you use those alone, you are missing central to everyday function and central to high performance. You're not evaluating the CNS. They cannot be used in isolation. And the acute-chronic is not new. That's Bannister's work from 1982. So we've known this for a while. But the piece of it is those kind of metrics, whether they're subjective or objective, and mood being one of the strongest indicators of a lack of recovery and a lack of adaptation, which acute-chronic ratios and RPE are not going to pick up. So absolutely there's value. There is no doubt. And again, there are even more direct ways to get CNS functioning, but if you're not evaluating simply on emotion and using, you know, dashboard systems which allow someone to very quickly answer on their smartphone, you're missing out a key variable, huge variable.
Sure. Brilliant. That's great. Listen, just before we move on to the next theme, moving away from the performing brain, Peter has just come in there as a follow-on question from Noah's question about the think about thinking query. And Peter is asking, would you name the explanation just given, which was your previous explanation, John, reinvestment in terms of thinking about thinking? Is that what you're alluding to there?
Can you elaborate on that? I want to make sure I'm hearing the question correctly.
Sure. So initially you were basically elaborating on what you meant by think about thinking, and that was your answer to Noah's question. And as we developed on into the health and high performance, Peter came in after and was just querying, could your explanation about think about thinking also be described as reinvestment?
Yes. I mean, I don't want to. I want to go back to an early thing I said is that bidirectional communication, cognitions, and how we think does affect how we perform and how we feel. What we've done is overemphasized it. So it can be a reinvestment, but we also have to look about that investment. If we are not calm, the investment of our cognitions is just giving us signals about warning within our functional system. So we're just reinvesting on fight or flight. Or worse, most people are familiar with fight or flight, but most people don't realize we have a third defense, which is shut down, which is the autonomic nervous system of the gut literally going flat with appetite or vomiting. That's not a good response. So unless we are calm, because emotions run the show on the brain, any reinvestment cognition-wise does not stick as well and stays alerted in the functional system as a warning. So again, it goes back to brain health and managing brain function.
Sure. Okay, yeah, Peter just came in to confirm what he meant was the execution to the procedural memory with the established movement or movement pattern. So.
See, again, you're interfering. So you're interfering with that process. When you have someone that has established very good expertise in, you know, visual systems of identifying pattern recognition, when you start to institute thought too much, what you do is disturb someone who actually can see and do. I'll give you a more life and death example. So I've had the honor of working with snipers. And snipers, we train snipers to manage their functional system by shooting between heartbeats, because blood pressure affects the eye, which is a simple lens, and how information is taken down the optic nerve to the brain. And so they have to shoot between heartbeats, getting their heart rates into 10 beats per minute, 20, 30 beats per minute. We use technology to assist with that. But we teach them how to breathe to reduce that. If you take someone Let's give an example. So as we normally talk about in sport, people, when they have slumps, they'll talk about overthinking. They'll talk about, I'm not myself. They'll even describe it as, I feel like I'm like, out of my skin a little bit. I feel like I'm freaking out, when this is something find so easy and so genuine to be able to do. Do you want a sniper in that position?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Sure.
And so thinking interferes with that. Even if they work in teams often, and even if there's communication between the team, that's done at such a proficient level. One word is all they need. And we know that in elite. One word or a facial recognition, just looking at someone a particular way. So those types of things in the process have to be kept low. And in fact, we overemphasize them.
Right. Very good. Very good. Well, I think that sums up where we were in the first phase of this discussion. John, thanks for that. And we actually have a question that's just come in that leads us nicely into the next section from, let me just see now, there's multiple questions coming in here now. So Edward Wilding was, why is grit and mental toughness a fallacy, which neatly brings us to the next section there.
Oh, sure. Happy to talk about that. Let's start with let's look at the history and then we'll go into the neurophysiology. So if we look at mental toughness, it is a rebranded term from hardiness in the 80s. And most people who have examined the research would say it has had no scientific footing since the 2000s. But even with that, it is socially constructed, and it is derived only from subjective ex post facto information. So after the fact observations, or after the fact asking someone questions. And it goes against that we are wired to survive. Mm-hmm. We have the most complex survival system in the known universe. There is not a question about toughness. It's a question about how you train the system to adapt. So mental toughness from a neurophysiology standpoint, a neuropsychology standpoint, is false. It has a false footing. And the research continues to more or less find nothing. And in fact, some research is quoted as, it has now become the position of it means everything and nothing, and has acquired this ethos from Hollywood that toughness is this amorphous mystical thing. I think example of the Oregon issue is that. That's mental toughness in action. I'm going to break them, and that will make them tough. Notice the functional system response is no. And so from a standpoint from neurophysiology and neuroscience, mental toughness is a fallacy. It's a concept that goes against adaptation and evolution.
Okay, so in that case, because this might come as a surprise to many of our listeners, so what would you perhaps substitute, for want of a better term, that whole concept and those actions with? What would you kind of advocate, or what would you educate your athletes on, as opposed to this concept of mental toughness?
Yeah, Keen, you brought up the terminology. The terminology you brought up earlier is actually neurophysiology terminology. Readiness. So readiness is an examination of actual physiology parameters and neurophysiology parameters that basically look at how much energy does the person have to produce for X. So, and we know this, the English Premier League's been doing this for years, saving millions of euros by actually protecting talent. On any given day, by measuring functional outputs or biometric outputs, heart rate variability, DC potential, core temperature, respiration rate, looking at nutrition, looking at time away from the facility, that they'll have three groups performing at any time. The red group, all right, that's functional recovery. We're probably just going to roll out. We're going to do some easy work. The middle group, we're going to do a medium load, and they'll have defined that and certainly have scientific parameters on that down to the individual. And then they'll have a green group. We're going to go because you have the most functional energy, and we've measured it over time and at the time of practice. So what we're talking about is peak performance is really a controllable state of energy by the central nervous system where it's healthy, it's stable, it's ready for demands. And that's the beauty of what we see in sport is when someone performs at such a high level, the brain is actually extremely efficient in its energy. It stores very little energy. Most of its energy comes from what we put in, and most neurotransmitters are actually derived from precursors of food. So when we look at extreme performance, it's based upon brain health and recovery day to day. Because the workout is stimulus for growth, the rest is where it comes together. And mental toughness discusses nothing about neurophysiology, nothing about neuropsychology, and it goes against, it provides a subjective definition to something you cannot measure because it's ex post facto, after the fact. We're measuring within and objective and subjective data.
Sure. So what does that say for the literally thousands of sports psychology books that are out there that have chapter upon chapter of mental toughness, mental strength? Would you dispel all that, John? Do you think there's a space for it, but they just need to elaborate more in terms of the concepts you're exuding there? Or what's your thoughts on that?
Keen, you just said it wonderfully. There are contents of those books that talk about mental skills that help with brain health. The research is very good on those areas, and those are skills that we want any performer to have. How do I manage emotions? You know, what are my routines that lead to rest and recovery, that lead to adaptation? So those skills have very good research. But the mental toughness piece can be separated from those skills. Those skills fit into a readiness model much better than they fit into a mental toughness model. Again, if we look at some of the research out there by Caddick and Ryan, looking at social constructiveness and mental toughness, they even talk about it as an ideology. And it has become an ideology because the science from 1980 till now with a rebranded term has not pushed us very far. And in fact, I think it's done more harm. Because we know that coaches, we've seen people do this. They'll observe an athlete and they'll go, they're not tough enough. If it's real science, we can't just see it with our naked eyes.
Yeah.
And especially if we're talking about something on the brain level, we can't accurately predict it. But there is meaningful things in those books, but it's typically related to the skills that help with brain health and brain function.
Sure, sure. In many ways, when it comes to this topical area, we're still very much living and practicing in the dark ages, John. And I think that'll be fair to say, especially with all your more recent research coming out. But I love your next slide, and particularly the title, The Inconvenient Truth of Sports, because I'm sure this is something, whether you're a child coach, an adolescent coach, an adult coach, an elite coach, I think all of these things are very relevant. And obviously you'd like to think less of the drinking and drug use for children. But you know, I think these are very, very important points. Would you like to expand on these in terms of the direction you would take with them?
Sure. I want to touch on a few things you mentioned because they're really pointed and well directed. One, I want to go back to grit, which is kind of the newest vernacular. I would encourage all our listeners to look at Dr. Marcus Creday's work. He did a meta-analysis of 2,000 studies of Duckworth's research and more, which included over 66,000 subjects. And he found that it doesn't correlate with success at all. In fact, she made an error that was over 30. Predicted 34% of the variance was due to grit, and when they corrected for a simple statistical mistake, it went down to 3%, and that meant that showing up to class was a greater predictor of success than grit. And it's another rebranded, repackaged term, and what is, I think, even more scary is that she's openly said grit is not ready for prime time, but populist belief, we want to believe in these things that there's an illusion of validity. We want to believe that these things work. But she's overstated her science. She's admitted it, but yet she continues in the public populace discussing grit as the next big thing. From a scientific standpoint, I let people judge for themselves, but she ethically has been called out as that scientific misconduct. And so when we think about kids, which you just brought up, they were looking to really generally bring this to schools and to sport when it's not been founded. And some people may think, well, what could go wrong with that? Well, we know with interventions that even if they're well-intentioned, they can do harm.
Yeah,
and so bring up kids, that's critically important, but even adult athletes, career maturity is important, for sure.
Sure. But I think you've almost brought it full circle to your initial point in terms of how Hollywood and related sports movies in particular can perpetuate this notion of the importance of grit and true grit. I love the way you brought that back to where you started. That's very interesting, yeah.
But to this slide, I think the inconvenient truth of sports is its trauma, which I mentioned earlier. And research really shows this, and I've worked a lot with exercise physiologists around the world and been able to kind of understand that although we use the term stress, and all of us know it, whether we know the proper definition or not, we know it, we have a concept of it. The brain doesn't interpret it as stress. It interprets it as trauma of varying degrees. And when we look at the slide you just showed, when we look at PTSD, and we look at it among individuals, what you're seeing there in that functional screen is varying degrees of it. And that's what sport does. We bring them, training is trauma, and we have to improve the rest side. Otherwise, it solidifies as trauma, and we expound on it. And if we look at the lifestyle behaviors of an athlete, then it certainly does degenerate positive brain health, inconsistent sleep patterns, nutrition, managing travel, inconsistent workflow. We certainly look at the overtraining and burnout. This is not something new. This is something Metrifit is a solution for, and other kind of platforms where we're measuring these things. And then when we just look at the organizational stress of sport, we all know there's politics involved with it. And so we have to start seeing that we're dosing trauma, and we have to dose it and time it correctly.
Yeah, and I mean all of those 4 points, obviously in any professional environment you have full-time experts in their respective fields, be it your medical team, your return to play team, your coaching team, whatever the case may be, and particularly something like Metrifit, a platform like that where it is amateur sport, or in a university setting, if it's a multi-campus team whereby a coach and a management team don't always have immediate contact and certainly face time with their athletes. I find that's where the importance of a platform like that is, particularly in terms of overtraining, burnout, injury, lifestyle behaviours. My own example, John, would be I'm based in Cork in the southwest of Ireland. The team I coach and manage is over in the east coast, just outside Dublin and Kildare. It's a 2-hour journey there every time I go to coach, but by 10 o'clock every morning, once my players and my athletes have logged in, to Metrifit in this case, whatever platform they use, I get a good understanding of exactly where they're at that day, taking in what you said earlier about mood state and stress as well. So I don't need to wait until I get there at 6 o'clock this evening to see 33 players turn up and then try and hypothesize or make an educated guess as to how they're doing or what their readiness to perform is. I'll be able to make a phone call, have a chat with them, contact the medical team, and hopefully, as a coach in an amateur sport with a professional ethos, that will help to reduce the trauma on the brain, which is what this slide is really alluding to.
And you make great points, Keen, because often what we're doing is just focusing on the load within sport, at the facility, or within training and within competition. But we've all heard people talking about, wow, it's the time in facility that we control so well, we can focus on their health, we can focus on their performance, but it's the hours away from the facility. And because this is just a truism of our central nervous system, everything loads the brain. So all time matters. And I'll give you a clear example from an NCAA athlete. So I've had the pleasure of working with some top endurance athletes. And so we all know or should become familiar with our understanding that sport is a multifactorial process. It is not one factor, never has been, and those factors are individual down to the athlete. And looking at that multifactorial piece, we were seeing some metrics, like you were talking about, for some of these endurance athletes were off, their performance metrics on the day. There was something about the rest and adaptation cycle. So we started to look at their time away, and we discovered that they were walking 8 to 10 miles a day on campus, addition to their study time, addition to their training time, addition to their social life. So there was not enough time for the adaptation system to recover. Everything loads the brain. We have to look at this at beyond acute chronic and beyond RPE, because brain health has an overwhelming impact on physical outputs, and that's a critical piece that we're often missing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just on that point, a question has just come in, and before we move on, I think we've touched on rest and recovery somewhat. I know a lot of people are interested in the readiness and resiliency in sport and life, but David had a question there. Just we move off that topic. He was asking, when talking about the whole picture of assessing the readiness of an athlete and mood, can HRV, so your heart rate variability, be substituted for mood assessment? So what he's asking is basically, will HRV capture the mood on a physiological level?
This is the way I would go at it, is yes, it can in some ways, but I think it's always important in sports science and science in general that we capture subjective and objective, because what gets interesting is when they come together and then when they diverge. We always want to be connecting with the people that we're working with, no matter where our position is, whether we're a coach, whether we work in sports medicine, whether we work in sports science. From an interpersonal neurobiology standpoint, that connection allows us levers to other places. Because quite simply, if you're in a profession where you need to connect with people, if you don't have connection, you have nowhere else to go. And that subjective import or information is really, really important, because we want our athletes a part of the process of enhancement in health and high performance. So without the questions, we may be missing information, but we're not getting them involved. In fact, that's one of the biggest mistakes I see in sports science. Sports scientists will gather data and they won't share it with the athletes. They only share it with the coaches. You're missing a fact there that your athletes are your workforce. Increasing their intelligence at any given moment, their awareness, their connection to the process enhances performance. You want to have them to have control. So I would always encourage getting the subjective and the objective.
Okay, very good, very good. And I would agree, Best practice would stay the same. We'll just move on, John, because we have a lot of interesting questions, but we've touched a little bit on rest and recovery, not too much, but I do know that readiness and resiliency is something you've touched on already, and I have some questions coming in on that. There's a nice, almost an infographic defining your career with some law enforcement stroke military pictures. You have isolated, you have the brain and the body. Do you want to just give us a brief synopsis of your thoughts on this in terms of readiness and resiliency before I have a question coming in on that topic?
Sure, happy to. Really, when we look at readiness and resiliency, we're looking at, as I talked before, more objective information that we want to include with the subjective, but it's also working off the principles of neuroplasticity, which is the fact that we once believed, that at 30 years old, our neuro abilities started to decline. That what we had is what we had, and it's just a downhill run from there. And again, probably many of us ignored that because that's not a great message and it's not a fun message to be hearing. However, it's not true. We are, again, wired to neurologically adapt, keep synaptic growth, allow us to have synaptic and neural recruitment. And so readiness is building on that idea that we can actually build cycles in that will allow us to deal with more and more training effect. And so readiness is that measurement from the CNS, which could be EEG, and then we're looking at from cardiac function, so we're looking at heart rate variability, which has already been brought up, and then we're also can be looking at gut-brain interaction, which is critically important, and actually I should have said it the other way. So we talk about the CNS as the brain, the gut is the second brain, and the heart is the third brain, or the little brain, is gathering information from these functional systems. And then also looking at, neuromuscular responses. We certainly can do a number of exercise physiology tests that give us some metrics on that. but it's looking at functional systems and getting that information on real time, and getting that subjectively, and getting that data, and not measuring everything. The English Premier League, that's how I started working in the English Premier League. Because of technology, we can virtually measure anything these days, but it doesn't mean we should. And I was brought over because if you understand the brain, you can start to see what has more power and what's worth measuring for readiness. But it's really looking on the day and then collecting over time. So we can look at the diversity of differences and then really looking at allowing us to pick the dose of training that allows for a transformation towards adaptation, getting stronger, getting faster, getting more endurance, reading plays better, understanding how to communicate better with teammates. All this is based upon brain. If we're not measuring, we just don't know. We just don't know. We're guessing.
Sure. And just on that point, Jeremy Worth has a very interesting question here. We're coming towards the end, but I'd like to think we'll run over a couple of minutes because I'd still like to hit the sports technology side of things.
Sure.
But here's a question. How do you explain the variety and appetite for training between individuals? Is there anything endogenous in an individual's psychological response to a training program? It can't all be environmental, or can it? Some athletes seem to have a higher tolerance or appetite than others. Are their brains, let's moving on to the next line, are their brains simply different?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. It's a fantastic question, and I'll try to answer it and touch on each of the pieces. Well, you start with human variation, so yes, I mean, we know athletes are very different, and we start to label them in those boxes, those inaccurate boxes like we talked about earlier, like mental toughness and grit. You are going away from finding really scientific answers to those questions. So yes, it can't be all environment. Environment is just one part of the multifactorial process. Environment does matter. Culture does matter, and there's been a lot of discussion of a high performance culture, but I've seen very little discussion of it from a neurophysiology standpoint because we're constantly collecting information. But it have to do with these pieces of variation. It goes to that dose effect, and it's a hermetic model, and all of us are familiar with it if we go medication-wise. Some people will take an antibiotic and it'll work. Others will have a moderate effect. Others will have a limited effect or an allergic response. And so there are these variations. Now, how do these brain properties get to have those varied things? We also can look at the research is still gaining ground on that, but those are fascinating questions about why is someone more resilient than others. But what typically we come back to is this multifactorial piece, and then it can even happen in utero about what is released from the mother about cortisol or about other particular hormones. But it's multifactorial. I go back to one piece of it that I heard was, one thing that's overlooked in sport is how motivation influences the central nervous system. How do you get athletes who are self-determined? And some of that has to do with rest cycles. We're often, think about our own lives. If we're worn down, we have less motivation. We have more increased survival symptoms. We feel it, we know it more, that we're just not 100%. That affects that self-determination of seeing an opportunity and leaning into it. So there are these factors for sure, but human variation answers a lot of it. And then you get down to the individual variation of looking at evaluation of how do I optimize this individual. And that's where I think for profound knowledge in sport we haven't looked at very much. We talk about individual variation, but we don't very much do it. Where I find my honor is doing it in in environments where life and death is on the line. We do it there because it's so specific.
And that's why you're so fascinated by your work with the military, I'm sure, is it?
Oh, absolutely. It's because we do a deeper dive, and we're really based upon health. Because if we don't, we have to be clear that, often when in athletics, we're happy if we're dealing with the 5% of the world. These are some of the best people in the world, and we're lucky when we get a 1%er. When we look at the elite military environments, I'm not saying they're all 1% elite athletes, but they are 1%ers in what they are asked to do. And so we have to keep them healthy, because if we lose them, we have no one that can take their place. So it's based upon health.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned culture just before that, and it's an interesting thing in terms of, once again, from my own practitioner and coaching background, trying to develop and create and instill a culture within a group, or more importantly, get the group to create that themselves. I'm sure you're familiar with James Kerr's book Legacy about the All Blacks,
Yes.
and the strong emphasis he places on culture in that book. Obviously, it's not scientifically derived. It's just a journalist's perspective from spending time with them. But have you ever considered or reflected on the All Blacks as a sporting power, as superpower? Of course, until the Irish bet them in Chicago a couple of months back, which it's always good to mention. But have you considered them as a sporting entity, or a machine, as they're very often referred to, John?
Yes, and I have great colleagues who are Kiwis and are exercise physiologists, so we've had quite wonderful conversations about this concept of culture, and often, some of the pieces that are ignored is how do you reduce the noise? And what I mean by that is if you're not communicating, it's not, another way of saying it is, it's not sufficient enough to tell someone to do their best if you don't tell them how. And there's plenty of noise out there that gets in the way of the process. And so you have to, as an organization, look clearly about your communication process and to overcome noise or to reduce it. And when we think about models around the world and what access we have now with smartphones, and we have access to a lot of misinformation, this is a real critical piece that they do well. And had the opportunity to evaluate some of their process, I very much see that as a critical component. But that's the critical component when we try to influence anyone. If we want to influence reduction in smoking, we want to influence exercise for health, we want to influence different ways about how we eat. Those are things, those are campaigns, and they require a communication process that's often overlooked. Most organizations, it's a new t-shirt and a new slogan. It's not sufficient. We know that for behavior change.
Sure, sure. Very good, very good. Okay, we'll briefly move on to the last theme that we said we would look at, which is technology in sport and the role of technology in sport. We have a couple of minutes left there, just running over. I'll try and get to any last questions we have. Just for anybody who we don't get to your question, we'll certainly send them on to John after the webinar, and he'll do his best to get back to you in a private message. But the role of technology in sport and utilizing it to optimize efficiency, effectiveness, performance. What are your thoughts on that, John?
I think we're in the middle of a technology revolution, and I know in some cases it scares people. I'm not numb to those arguments, but we've been through other revolutions before, industrial revolutions. Now we learned that it probably wasn't a good idea to have children work third shift in dangerous environments, so we adapted. I trust we will here too, but I think there is a lot of noise out there. Systems that are making claims, and I've written about this with colleagues like Dr. Shona Holson from the Australian Institute of Sport and Dr. Jonathan Peake from Queensland University of Technology, and I've also spoken about it recently at the Consumer Electronics Show. And I think there is some things that any of us who are in the position of working with high-level performance, we just have to keep in mind. Because technology should be used as a tool, and I think there are fine tools out there. There's much garbage, there's much noise, but I think we have to answer a few questions that we've provided here in the slide. You have to justify and know that there has been some health and safety analysis of the technology. If it does harm, that should stop anyone from moving forward. And to not ask the question is to leave a lot of question marks. If we're harming athletes from the use of technology, I think, these are prime things that should redirect our moral compass to go elsewhere. But also we have to answer the questions why we're using it. What are our ultimate goals? What do we want answered? And then this gets to the legal question, which was quite big at CES, Consumer Electronics Show, was who owns the data? But protecting data is critically important because we're protecting people's privacy in a lot of ways.
Of course.
Yeah. And then how will the data be used? Who are we disseminating it to? Then also, has the technology had validation through theoretical validation, signal validation, laboratory, in field? These things are critical. I get calls all the time from my positions of people wanting to talk about technology with me, as well as I reach out to companies. And if they can't answer the first question about safety, it's a non-starter. And so, and there is plenty of stories out there of technology harming people, you know, and one example is direct transcranial direct stimulation. In most states in the United States, it's illegal. It's illegal in Canada. And if laboratory work is fine, we understand how to do direct stimulation. It's a fantastic modality, deep stimulation for Alzheimer's. But that's done under extreme medical conditions. Doing it from consumer devices, no validation's been done. We don't know if it's helping, hurting, or landing somewhere in the middle. So I get excited about technology, but we just have to be thoughtful about it as a tool.
Sure, sure, okay. And I suppose some of the examples you're using there are on the very advanced scales. In terms of technology that's designed to support your athletes, such as obviously our sponsors for today, Metrifit, and having a platform like that that is kind of an intermediary between players and coaches. It allows them to feed in their own psychometric data as a communication tool. As long as you can, you know, lose the noise, as you call it, which is a nice term, but also ensuring that, you know, you're refining it to the knowledge you need and not almost an exponential amount of data. You still see huge value in using technology like that with athletes.
Absolutely, Keen. You touched on a real important piece there. Is often the mistake that organizations make when they take in technology like Metrifit, where it's an aggregate of data, we can get in data, is starting too big. And I know Ann and Peter are very versed in this, in the sense of you want to start an organization small, make it effective, make it you know, understandable to the end user, but also actionable. And often organizations will start too big. I want to measure everything, and then you overwhelm the systems, the coaches, the support services, and certainly the athletes themselves. That's a very, very sharp observation. Start small and make it focused.
Sure, sure. Very good, very good. Listen, John, we're after running over there, but I found it was so interesting. I was enthralled in what you were saying that I didn't want to shut it off at 4 o'clock, as I'm sure our listeners were feeling the same. There are a couple of outstanding questions. Sorry, folks, that I didn't get to read them out on air, but we'll certainly endeavour to address them offline. John, just to say thank you very much on behalf of myself and obviously on behalf of Peter and Ann, who sponsored this webinar. It was a pleasure and an honour, but also a huge education for myself as a coach, as a practitioner, as well as an academic. I really enjoyed everything that you were providing to us in terms of your thoughts. Just in terms of the book itself, you mentioned earlier, just offline before we started, in terms of where a lot of the proceeds of this book are going. Do you want to just explain to all our listeners about that, John? Because I think it's a very valid and a very human point.
Yeah, you know, the inspiration to write the book came out of a conversation, like most great things, but part of the book and part of what we talk about has been influenced by my experience and honor of working with the military and the elite military. So proceeds of the book go to veterans charities worldwide. So because war, some of the lasting wounds have to do with brain health. And much of what we know about the brain has to do with the great sacrifice that is made, and then also through the training that our elites go through. So for Chris Parker and I, no pun intended, or maybe pun intended, it was a no-brainer. We had to honor the men and women who have made those sacrifices.
Fantastic. Well, the book is called The Brain Always Wins, everybody. On behalf of myself and the team at Metrifit, I would just like to say a huge thanks to John, Dr. John P. Sullivan again, who's dialed in from the US today, signing out from Cork in Ireland and Cork Institute of Technology. I'd like to thank you all for listening, and keep tuned to the Metrifit info sheets and emails, because we try to hold these type of webinars once a month. It's going to be incredibly tough to try and top what we just heard today, John. You've really set a high standard for 2017. So thanks again, and I look forward to hearing and learning and reading and writing all about you very soon.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody, and thank you, Peter and Ann. Cheers.
Take care. Bye, folks.